I'm going to begin with Anup Punya, who is the Indian Program Manager at GSCC Climate Trends, and joining us very, very, very early. Thank you so much for being here. He is the former president of the Indian Youth Climate Network and coordinated a key campaign which pushed the World Bank to divest from fossil fuels. So certainly be leaning into some of the crossover there. Anup, would you like to make a few opening comments before I move to our next panelist?
Right. Thank you, Saroja. I hope you can hear me.
We can.
All right, good. Thank you to you and to the 5040 team to give me the opportunity to speak here and share some of my experience that might be relevant. Okay, so I will share my screen because I have a presentation to make. But do you want me to just stick to the introduction?
Go ahead. Or certainly, yes. You can just jump right in, please.
All right. Okay, let's do that then. Let me know if you're able to see.
The screen hasn't shared yet. Now here we go.
Is it visible?
Yeah, we can see it.
All right, thanks. Okay, so I am currently working with Climate Trends. It's a strategic communications agency in India, a sister affiliate of a global network on climate communications, which is called GSCC, Global Strategic Communications Council. But for my presentation and my talk today, I would draw upon my experience from the time I was working on Shifting Financial Flows campaign directly aimed at World Bank on the energy finance. I see Adrian is here today from the Inter-American Development Bank, and that was the time when we also had the chance to interact with other banks also, IDB being one of them, and actually quite friendly colleagues there, which is a good experience back then. But I will focus on World Bank for today. And the idea is, I was asked by the organizers was to draw upon lessons from the campaign that we organized on energy finance aimed at the World Bank, and how that could support the thinking here with the global food system and the financial flows within that. So hopefully this would be of use to you, and and also, yes, one very important point. This is not exhaustive. There's lots out there that happened that went into contributing to the shift, but this is just from my experience, and also it's just a conversation starter. So I hope this would lead to more engagement and more discussion on this. So yes, please do note that this is not an exhaustive view of the entire the state of affairs that happened. Right. So starting on, I'm going to give you this short timeline of how the shift was evolving in the World Bank's energy finance portfolio. It started around 2013 when they first pledged to end direct financing of coal, and they kept some reservation for rare circumstances, especially for poorest countries, where renewable energy would have been more expensive than fossil finance. Fossil finance refers to coal, oil, gas as the primary sources of energy for power projects, for various energy needs, including transportation. So as climate discourse in the world was catching up, World Bank at that stage felt the need to also play their part, and they announced that they would get out of coal. We entered the campaign around 2015, 2016, and chose to focus on World Bank amongst other banks, which I'll get into why as to later. But continuing with the timeline, they then announced in 2017 that they will no longer finance upstream oil and gas from 2019 onwards. And they also made two allied commitments to report on their emissions footprint from the various energy projects, and basically to add to the transparency, and also have a shadow price, which will, in a way, make the pricing of the projects more realistic, in factoring in the environmental costs as well. So whatever they're contributing to the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions from their energy projects, which was causing climate change, they decided to put a price on it, so that they can make more realistic financial choices. This being the timeline, what I really also try to put in perspective at the bottom is that while they were making these commitments, they continued to finance fossil finance projects. And the recent research released in October this year showed that since Paris Agreement, which happened in 2015, they at least financed $12 billion of fossil fuel projects, energy projects. And this is at least because there's lack of transparency. So this amount can actually go into more than 50 or 60 billion dollars because there's not enough data available. And this is through civil society research. As they mentioned that they were to be giving money for only poorest countries in the rare exceptions. It happened that a lot of the money also went to G20 countries and top oil producing countries, so not only the poorest ones. Now, why I put this is here to put it into perspective that the campaign was aiming for certain outcomes in terms of pledges and commitments, and there are a lot of things that your target audience or the target that you have for your campaign might be conceding or might be doing things which you think as your campaign win, but there could always be things going under the carpet or in a hidden form, and we need to be really cautious and mindful of that. As we learned that while we were securing these commitments from the World Bank, they still continue to finance, and the complex financial scenario, which we probably need to also unpack for the global food system, will be essential to take note, because financial flows can really get complex. There are so many different vehicles to channel finance, and it's not easy to unpack all of it. And plus, with the limited capacity of civil society, it's also not always easy. To move on. Very quick review of the kind of big words and the statements that were coming in right from the top at that time. The president of the World Bank, Jim Yong Kim, showing that the World Bank is on the right side and they want to do what they did on climate. And all these statements were being made. But yeah, the reality was also turning out to be different. But I chose to put these statements here because this was one of the in a way, one of the things that we were looking for as the campaign, to secure commitments right from the top, because then that allows you to hold the senior leadership to account, because they said this in public and they at least showed that their intention is right. So, here is my brief overview of the approach that the campaign was taking. Broadly, you could say we aimed for reputation risk. And let me unpack that for you. We identified the target for the campaign, World Bank, because it's one of the top global financial institutions. It's meant to do public good through its public development finance, and the bank, in its own words, was keen to be seen as a climate leader. So it puts itself, it was making itself vulnerable to have a reputation risk, because if it does not walk its talk, then it can hurt the goodwill. To our own dismay, we realized that after 2015 also, the bank continued to finance for fossil energy projects in a big way, not just in a small amount. So that's the approach we took, that we will create a reputation risk, because it's not right for a leading financial institution funded by public money to be not really living up to its own commitment. So, but the financial flows ecosystem is quite complex, and over the last decade, it has actually become more complex. Many ways of channeling finance have been evolved, and it's not always easy to track the money. So, with our limited capacity, we chose to highlight 12 dirtiest projects, in the sense that they were having a really high impact on the greenhouse gas emissions, on the environment, and these impacts were not limited to just emissions. They're also bad for the immediate surrounding environment, for the ecology, for the communities living nearby, and so on and so forth. The benefits from the project were always not necessarily going to the communities that were, at least publicly, that were they claimed to be benefiting. So we every year we would highlight 12 projects that we were calling the Dirty Dozen. What it did was it brought in to focus the how the money was being channelized from institutions like World Bank and its various affiliates, including private banks, commercial banks. Even if the money from the bank was not too big, because these are multi-billion-dollar projects and there are other entities involved, but how public finance coming from an institution like World Bank was intended to de-risk the project, to ensure that if nobody is willing to take the risk, World Bank's money was available, and that would make the project feasible. If institutions like World Bank are not there, the project will not be feasible, and it's easy to get the project stopped. So this was our approach. Every year we used to do this, and this was helping because it would shed light on the players and open the conversation. Also, we decided not to antagonize the World Bank itself. We kept a constant dialogue with the entities, with the management at all levels, including the board. That was really helpful because they got to understand our perspective. We were even sharing the research findings that we were having to give. We used to give the draft reports to them for them to vet before we go public, so that they have had a chance to either contest or to present their side of the story. And over a period of time, this dialogue that was kept open with the World Bank management led to them realizing that there are certain right things to be said and certain right things to be done, which if they do at certain key moments of the calendar year, it will actually put them in good light, and then they pick that up. Quite close to completing the presentation. Our campaign was not the only effort that went into securing these commitments. We were actually building on a legacy of a variety of civil society efforts for many, many years. So there were grassroots confrontation on the projects that were financed by the World Bank. There was efforts by civil society previously on naming and shaming, including expose. Formal complaints were filed with the grievance redressal mechanism. So there were a lot of efforts that had already put the bank and its financing in a spotlight. And when we entered, you could just say it was the last mile or just the tipping points, which our civil society effort. And when I say us, basically it was an alliance of many civil society organizations. So their efforts helped with the tipping points, and we were securing these commitments, especially the ones from 2016-17 onwards, which I showed you previously in the timeline. And yes, the having a sub-global agreement like Paris was helpful because it created the spotlight on finance, and there was a moral imperative. When US sort of vacated the seat with President Trump coming in, French president stepped up. He continued the momentum of walking the talk at the highest levels and not dropping the ball on the game. So these are certain helpful elements happening in the wider ecosystem, which were not directly part of our campaign, but it was, you could just say these were things that were helping the discourse to be kept on the right platform. And then every year there were at least three key moments in the calendar where the World Bank had the opportunity to do the right thing, say the right words, and basically look good. So we designed the campaign in a way where the World Bank felt that they are constantly under watch. We used a variety of tools to make sure, including the digital ones. So yeah, this sort of led to that, and I've just put in some references, which if in case the presentation gets shared, you can take a look at it.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to rush you along, Anoop, because it's a very full picture that you're giving us, and I want to make sure that we have time for the other panelists to speak. But thank you for really setting the stage for the conversation here, because you've managed to speak about all of the players in this conversation, some of whom are actually on this panel. I wanted to turn to Karina Millstone, who is the Executive Director of Feedback Global. And the reason that I think there's some interesting crossover here is because some of what Anoop is speaking about is lessons that can be learned from fossil fuel and coal divestment campaigning. And you have been looking at some of the civil society response there. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your work and also how it might cross over with some of what Anoop has presented here. In the interest of time, I would just ask you to keep it to less than 4 minutes.
Super, thank you. Thank you very much, Soraya. I'm Karina from Feedback. We're an environmental campaign group based in London, working on food system transformation. And a key part of that transformation we've come to realise is the shift away from animal protein, and especially the shift away from factory farming, hence our interest today. So it's super interesting to what Anupa had to say, because we are working on divestment from private sector institutions, calling on finances to stop lending to the industrial meat and dairy industry. Just to avoid repeating what Anupa said, I think it's worth noting that obviously the fossil fuel industry and the livestock industry have some significant differences. But from a campaigner's perspective, there's some real strategic advantages to making an analogy between the two. And that's because policymakers, businessmen, or business leaders and all this already understand that the fossil fuel industry needs to end to avert catastrophic climate change. But there isn't this understanding yet, I think, widespread understanding in terms of the livestock industry. So as campaigners, if we can kind of position both fossil fuels and livestock in the same bucket, we create the same narrative that this is an industry on a par with fossil fuels, and therefore it also needs to end. And I think a further benefit of this is that we can start piggybacking on the existing legislations, the existing Paris targets, business level initiatives to reduce emissions, and make sure that meat figures as part of that conversation in the same way as fossil fuel does. So in terms of the question of, how did the shift happen in fossil fuels? Who were the key actors, and how could this be replicated for meat? So in my view, really the key actors who did secure this shift were really the people working hard on divestment. So really people who were willing to adopt a radical flank position, a refusal to negotiate with the meat industry, and who called for the calling on the radical position: the fossil fuel must end, therefore we need to stop lending, stop funding the industry. So while Carbon Tracker, of course, did this kind of the seminal analysis that showed that the fossil fuels on the books of the big fossil fuel companies couldn't be burnt to remain within a safe level of warming. In my view, it was really the divestment movement, initially brought into being by Bill McKibben in the States, that really was what made that shift. And we now know that thanks to the effort of these community groups and the faith groups, students, civil society, that at least $11 trillion worth of assets have been moved out of fossil fuels from institutional investors. I think there's a few other kind of maybe things to highlight in terms of why this strategy ought to be replicated. I think it's really crucial that we elevate meat beyond the personal. I think that we are kind of stuck with meat where energy was in the 90s, the idea it's a matter of personal choice. Before we might have been told we need to just put, an extra jumper on. And at the moment, there's still this issue of, light measures, meatless Mondays, eat less meat, and so on. This is really an opportunity, thinking about divestment, defunding, to elevate this debate to structural issues and issues of corporate monopoly and corporate lobbying, and fundamentally social injustice. So it's a real opportunity, yes, as I say, to address structural issues beyond more of a lifestyle kind of debate that might be happening. The fossil fuel divestment movement also delegitimized the fossil fuel industry in public discourse. It's lost its social license to operate. And we saw this earlier this week with Denmark, actually formally committing to ending the industry. And I think that same process can happen with meat, especially at the moment when there is a beginning of a cultural shift. And there's also, of course, kind of plant-based proteins coming onto the market. So that same process can happen. And then maybe a final point to raise, I mean, the University of Michigan did a big analysis on the fossil fuel divestment movement and showed that this radical flank position enabled the uptake of more moderate measures. So the notions of carbon budgets, for example. And again, I see that process of these of adopting interim measures starting to happen in meat already, thanks in part to adopting a more radical position. So issues around, institutions, public institutions in the UK committing to serve less meat, for example. I know we're short on time, but just to wrap up for me, then I think, for me, this change is going to be driven by the people. By this, I mean students, civil society, faith groups, communities, really people who are willing to mobilize and agitate and really take the stand that this industry needs to end. And in that sense, I think the key lever here is the manufacturing of public outrage. This is the reputational risk that Anouk mentioned. So we need to manufacture this public outrage, the fact that there are businesses and their financiers that are still profiting and making the money on the back of ecological destruction and climate injustice that is core to this industry. I'll leave it at that for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much for that, Karina. I want to create opportunity for everyone to participate. There was something that you were just talking about, and it also came up in Anoop's presentation, which is that, of course, the being on the inside of institutions and being able to have those conversations is a key part of this. But we happen to have here with us today Paula Lookinghorse, who has been involved in Indigenous rights protection for more than 20 years. She's organized Run to Pipestone and the Thanksgiving Feast campaigns, has an enormous amount of passion for working with young people and teaching them the importance of participation. Paula, if I could look to you for a moment, because mobilization is clearly an important part of shifting those financial flows, that it's not just a question of investments, and it isn't just a question of having conversations about risk and creating a boundary for that risk. There is an actual mobilization of people behind this. And I wondered if maybe you might like to lean in with some of your thoughts on the effects of industrialized livestock systems on Indigenous communities and how that has helped to fuel this movement away from livestock and investing in alternative forms of alternative food systems. That was a real mouthful. I'd mostly like to just welcome you to this conversation and allow you some room to speak.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate being a part of this panel today. The passion of addressing the dairy farm, that's how I got started in trying to understand, the practices of the dairy farms, because I grew up in a rural area where that mom and pop dairy farms, and they had their cattle, and back in the 60s and 70s, and then all of a sudden the big corporations start moving in, and not just in dairy farms, but in agricultural as well. As a matter of fact, I was going to school at the University of Minnesota Marshall, and I was going into rural studies, and I was only Native in the class. And at that time, our teacher was talking about, about the movement of these bigger corporations coming in to feed, the masses, so to speak. And I wrote a paper and not really realizing what my Native perspective in growing, because a lot of the ranchers and leasers of our lands, we get to know them personally, and they're pretty attached to their land when they grow food, and when they have dairy farms, and it wasn't really so imposing. And so I made a point of, if you start taking this land and you strip the responsibilities of families that have been passed down the dairy farms and the agricultural, you're gonna create a big depression, because it's their livelihood, and they're still attached to the land, and they're attached to the animals. And and that's like chickens and whatever. When you're growing up rurally, it was more of a trade. I remember my mother going and just buying chickens, chickens down the road or eggs. And so I'm really grassroots that way. And so, and wouldn't you know, it became true the following year. And the teacher actually tracked me down and he showed me my old paper, and there was a lot of suicides going on with, the different farmers because the banks, if you recall, those of you that are as old as me, I'm 64. If you remember, they started going bankrupt and forcing them out, and the corporations were taking over their lands. And so I always remember that because I knew just down the road from where I would pass by, going to school, and, that there was just a lot of people around this farm, and I felt bad. And I didn't realize that what I was saying, this depression of people losing their land, that it would act so fast. And so when people try to conquer lands and conquer, situations, in a name of money, for me, I moved home on my reservation to take care of my son who was brain injured. And immediately, one of the times that he took off from me, I just had this most, this whole putrid smell in the air, and I never smelt such a thing, um, and then I started asking questions, and I moved in, to the native housing, and it was right across the road. And I didn't realize what I moved into because it was kind of like cold when I moved in, and the south wind didn't come yet. And so that opened up the whole realization that this big conglomerate moved in, and I researched the whole history. And then I started using some of our funds we do international peace work to do testing. And we found out how much E. coli was happening. And I mean, I could go on and on, but I don't want to take all your time. It was a long process. And then I made this blog called Miniwichoni, and that was before Standing Rock. And then all of a sudden, with the pipeline, they took over my blog. Miniwichoni means water of life. And because we found out we're on a continental divide, kind of north, eastern South Dakota, Minnesota, and North Dakota. So we're right there where the rivers go the four directions. And so this contamination, and I was trying to say, well, you guys are scared of the pipeline breaking. What about what's going on right now? There's no more turtles, there's no more fish. It's going on, right? It's going into the Mississippi and down into the Delta. And you know what? My voice was small. And then I contacted many people throughout time, and one of my friends, Janet, and I contacted some other lawyers, and you need money, to fight this. But then recently I found out that this big Marshall Dairy is owned by a church. And actually the postmaster told me this. And I was shocked. And so I started asking questions. How could a church, knowingly, contaminate a whole four directions of a continental divide with over 35,000 cattle? That's how much we knew, 5 years ago. And, there's 6 big ponds across the street that is a quarter of a mile of 14 houses where kids play outside. Nobody pays attention. And because it's out of sight, out of mind, even my own tribe. And then I found out how my tribe was complicit to these actions because they sold that land to the last dairy farmer who didn't even pay for it. He went bankrupt and we lost it. And it should have went through Congress, and it should have taken like 2 to 3 years for trust land to move out of trust. And so they got a deal, and Marshall Dairy is owned by a church.
Right.
And I can't understand that. So right. I guess that's my deal. But one more thing I wanted to say to them about the World Bank is we were at the UN, and I asked about how the World Bank could help Indigenous people of Turtle Island. And they told us that we have to be a third world country. And I felt like that wasn't fair. And then the other thing with Karina, as far as, the meat industry, this whole land was filled with buffalo. We are the buffalo people. I have it on my, and we feel the strength of the buffalo because that's who we are as a people. And, our whole spirit of it, we used the whole buffalo. We didn't, wasn't contaminated. And then you got to understand that the Buffalo Nation has pointy hooves, and they catch the rain, and and their saliva doctors the earth. And so, that the Buffalo Nation is attached to Turtle Island. And as far as the cattle industry, they're flat-footed. They tear out the roots. They don't mow like buffalo do. So, I'm sorry to say we are meat eaters, and we do have our ranches here on a tribal land. We finally got some back. And you know what? Where they thrive, the medicines are coming back. The water's coming back, and it's a beautiful thing to watch what the buffalo can do as a doctor.
Paula, thank you so much for it's a hard story to squeeze into a small moment of a panel. We really could be speaking all afternoon and learn so much from you. But thank you for giving us a window into your community and your experience. And it really helped to frame a conversation on financing, to understand that there is a relationship. The ownership of goods has a real impact in your community in that example. Thank you so much. I want to make sure that we have a moment for Kezia and also for Adrian, who have been patiently waiting. Thank you so much. I'll start with you, Kezia, because I'm sure that your ears perked up a little bit listening to especially the two opening panelists. You're an ESG analyst at FAIR, and you'll be able to tell us a little bit more about what you do. But you're more in the institutional space, whereas Paula's been speaking to us about the impact on the ground and what she has seen in her community and how they mobilized. You have been engaging private investors towards sustainable protein supply chains. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that. And I'm sorry to tell you about the lack of time that we have, but if you could please keep your comments to just 3 or 4 minutes.
Sure, thank you. It's fantastic to be part of this conversation. And as you just introduced, my name is Kezia Smythe. I'm an ESG analyst at the FAIR Initiative. And to briefly introduce FAIR, we work with institutional investors to raise awareness of these many systemic environmental, social risks that the other speakers have highlighted in relation to intensive animal agriculture. And we work to drive change through the capital markets. We know that intensification of animal agriculture and overconsumption of meat and dairy won't enable us to live within planetary boundaries and to meet Paris Agreement goals. And today I'm kind of bringing a bit of a different perspective to some of the other panelists. It's the perspective of how investors can engage with companies that they're involved in to drive change, to highlight that it's not just about divestment. As it stands, demand still exists for meat and dairy products, and this is changing, but it's not going to change overnight, and the system can't change overnight. So I really see divestment and engagement as complementary and in dialogue with one another in terms of bringing about the change that we need to see. And in terms of what we mean by engagement, there are really a number of key levers that investors can pull to try and drive change within a company that they're invested in, to try and reform the company's practices. And that's before they might ultimately decide to divest, if they decide that divestment is the only option, if in the end they don't see any tangible responsiveness or progress from a company. In the meantime, they can vote at annual meetings, they can bring shareholder resolutions against companies, they can attach conditions to loans they might give, and they can engage with companies directly to raise awareness of issues and ask companies to change their disclosure, their actions, or their strategies. And in the short term, in terms of trying to drive change in the short term in particular, at FAIR, we've seen some real successes from helping investors to engage directly with companies in the food system, to get them to recognize some of these social and environmental issues. The list is super long of everything that's a problem with animal agriculture. And my work is primarily on what we call our sustainable proteins engagement, which is with 25 global food manufacturers and retailers, and that includes Unilever, Nestle, General Mills, Costco, Walmart. And in this engagement, in a nutshell, institutional investors are using engagement with companies to drive change towards more sustainable protein supply chains. And in 2020, we represented a coalition of 88 institutional investors that represented over 13 trillion total dollars in assets under management. And that alone is a real signal about how investors are beginning to, more and more investors are beginning to seriously engage with the issues of how we shift away from an overexploitation of animals for protein. And the engagement is specifically asking companies, do they recognise the materiality of the environmental impacts of existing animal agriculture, some of which Paula highlighted? Do they recognise that there's increasing demand for plant-based alternatives? And bringing in these reputational risks that Anoop mentioned, but also increasingly the material, environmental and social risks highlighted by climate change, driven by climate change and that COVID's highlighted. So we're asking, how are these companies addressing these issues? And ultimately, investors want companies, through engaging with them, to set time-bound commitments to transition their protein portfolios so that they are truly sustainable, whether mitigating the environmental impacts in the supply chain or transitioning their portfolios to be more plant-based. And we've seen some great successes from engaging with companies, from having meetings with them and raising this issue. Tesco in the UK recently committed to a target to grow their sales of meat alternatives 300% by 2025. Unilever is targeting €1 billion in annual sales of plant-based foods in the next 5 to 7 years. And Woolworths is a final example. It's a retailer in Australia that's aiming to have sustainable beef and soy supply chains by 2025. And of course, these are goals and commitments. They're not perfect. They're yet to come to fruition. And you can have healthy skepticism about if they're likely to happen. If you look at parallels with things like the deforestation commitments from 2020 that were set to happen in 2020 and companies didn't meet. But I really think they show how retailers and manufacturers, from our engagement and in other engagements that we've done, we see similar changes from company policies in other areas. It really shows that investors can call for change and companies will take these issues more seriously. I know I'm pretty much out of time, but basically, to quickly recap, divestment is a powerful tool and a powerful signal, and it's really important, as Karina said, to really move that over to window, to really change the conversation and allow more moderate positions, as well as the radical calls for just not investing at all. But it's not the only tool that exists for investors. It's also sometimes not the first option, if it is an option at all for many investors, based on the way that they invest and based on their investment mandates. And in general, and I think Anoop touched on this earlier, we need to think clearly about what kind of investor and what kind of financial institution you're dealing with. This is also relevant in relation to Paula talking about a faith-based investor and how you would expect them to care about their communities and stakeholders and the kind of rationale for why they might invest in something. We need to think about the different levers and different incentives for public development banks versus private equity versus pension funds, and also the different asset classes that have different opportunities and limitations for both engagement and also divestment. And of course, in all of this, civil societies and NGOs can have and do have a really strong amplifying and agenda setting impact by helping investors to care about this issue, and then in turn, investors can engage companies and use their influence for good. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I hope that you didn't feel too breathless, because what you were explaining to us is so fascinating. I feel like you and our next panelist, Adrian, are both helping us bring this full circle from where Anoop started, that beginning to make those changes and discussions with the World Bank, and actually trying to figure out what this is going to look like as investors are encouraged to shift. Adrian Folk, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, is a senior climate change economist and with the Inter-American Development Bank. Welcome to the panel. I'm sorry to push you to the end, but I actually feel that what you're going to address really helps to close that circle, because you're a specialist in a number of things, including net zero economies, but you are seeing potential benefits and co-benefits of shifting to more plant-based diets in Latin America and the Caribbean. Could you tell us a little bit about your work, and if you have some response to some of the other panelists, you're also welcome to make it now. We are already at 2 minutes after the hour Central Eastern Time, or Central European Time, so if you could just leave it to 4 minutes, I'd be so grateful.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. We work with the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean, and usually the ministries of environment. And a big part of my job is to help them have the knowledge they require to implement the Paris Agreement. So, as you know, the objective is to limit temperature increases below 1.5, as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. And that requires getting to net zero carbon emissions by around 2050 globally. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, 30% of CO2 emissions come from deforestation. So we need to stop deforestation and instead reforest so we can capture CO2. And deforestation itself can be linked to food systems and in particular to beef production, because most of the land, agricultural land in Latin America and globally really, is used for producing meat, basically either for grazing or for growing feeds such as soybean. And that's definitely the case in Latin America. And that's why a shift in diet away from beef and towards a little bit more of a plant-based agriculture can help implement the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, you know, there's a pandemics, the countries of the region are suffering from COVID. So there's no way they're going to implement any changes in food production systems if it doesn't help them in terms of social and economic benefits. So is it a good moment to do this now? Our answer is yes, and part of the reason is that book we published with the ILO in July on jobs in a net zero emissions future for the region, where we find that if the governments in the region make a step towards net zero emissions by 2050, there could be a net creation of 15 million jobs in the region. That's net, with winners and losers. And in particular, there's 19 million jobs that could be created in plant-based agriculture. So what's the way forward? How do we help them from the IDB? We try to help countries design inclusive decarbonization plans and to ensure a just transition to a net zero economy. So that means, for instance, in this case, making sure that agricultures and indigenous communities, for instance, participate in the design of climate strategies so that they can be part of the conversations when the government builds a roadmap to net zero and understands what are the opportunities and what are the challenges, and then participate in the discussion on how to size the opportunities and how to tackle the challenges. Among the opportunities, for instance, the 19 million jobs that I mentioned, these are going to be good jobs only if the government does something about it. Today, agriculture is often a place where people are poor, lack social protection, don't have access to markets. You need to solve all of these issues with agriculture policy if you want the 19 million jobs to be good jobs. And you also need to address the challenges. We don't see a complete phase out of the livestock industry. We only, in our simulations, we only lose about 5% of the jobs in the region related to livestock. That's because it's not about not consuming meat at all. It's about reducing the reliance on meat compared to a baseline where as you get richer, you get more meat intensive. But still, that's a few workers and communities affected by that. And so you need to help them cope with the consequences of a decarbonization strategy. That can mean retraining for the livestock workers. That can mean helping the communities where there's nothing else than livestock jobs to create jobs or to migrate to other places to work. And maybe just to finish, we do have a lot of financial support for this. The international community is very keen in funding climate ambition. For instance, in Costa Rica, they have a plan to get to net zero emissions by 2050 with a full policy roadmap to enable it. And recently, the IDB with the French Development Agency lent them $380 million conditioned on implementing that policy roadmap. And then also we raised more than $8 million in grants to help the government also with the implementation of the plan. And I think that's just an example of how there is money available if the countries have the ambition.
Adrian, you've managed to land on exactly the first question from our participants, and the only question that we actually have time for, which is, what do you think is the best way to fund farming transition, and where should the money come from? You've given us a few options to think about through grants and some of the work that you've described. Kezia, if I could come back to you with that question, I think you might have some thoughts on where the money should come from for a transition like this.
Well, I think we're increasingly seeing investment from some of the companies in the existing food system, for instance, and increasingly with investors asking them to take environmental and social sustainability, just transition, these things into account when looking at environmental and social risks. So we're increasingly seeing some companies in the system actually committing their own investment to ensure that supply chains become more sustainable and that workers may be protected from COVID, for example. I think there are also interesting initiatives that we see in terms of trying to help farmers transition away from meat and dairy production if it's something where they're locked into a contract where it's not economically very viable for them. There's interesting initiatives like the Transformation Project and Refarmed, and I think there's a bit of an opportunity in there for more kind of impact investing and philanthropic investing to help on the ground with some of the change that we need to see to increase the plant-based production to enable growth in plant-based consumption as well.
Thank you for that. Karina, I'm going to come to you for the last word, just extending that question about how that transition should be funded.
Yeah.
You started to lean into that a little bit in your opening comments. I'm sorry that your first comments are your opening comments and your last comments are your closing ones, but I'd appreciate your opinion on this question.
Yes.
Would you like me to rephrase the question for you? I don't want to put you on the spot at all.
No. You asked me, yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. I just think, yeah. No. I mean, in my view, I perhaps have a different opinion to Kirsti's. I mean, I worry a bit, and I'm a bit skeptical about leaving the transition on this scale, where the end goal is ultimately social justice, equity, and ecological sustainability, to financial markets. In my view, the only actor that has the legitimacy to undertake a transition on this scale are governments. So certainly in the UK, we have seen governments step up in terms of COVID, find some money for subsidies to bail out the economy. In my view, we now have a climate crisis, an ecological crisis, a crisis in our food system, and it's incumbent on governments to lead that transition and finance it as well.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I'm so sorry that we are so squeezed for time, but at least we got to be in this digital space together. I'd like to extend especially a thank you to Paula, because it's always wonderful to have our elders speak to us. And I am sitting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So I'm so glad to have had your words, which are very different. It's not often that we get the chance to have an elder in a conversation about financial flows. Thank you. Anoop, thank you so much for your presentation. Karina, Kezia, Adrian, thank you so much for your insights, and also for taking the risk to disagree with each other, because we learn so much in those moments of small conflict. This is a sketch that's been put together by Mike Brennan, who is our sketch artist, helping to capture some of the feeling and sentiment, since we can't all be in the same room together. So there are each of you and me in conversation, captured forever. Thank you so much to all 5 of you.